Students, this is the second part of our week number 8 lecture, and we have the lecture 22, 23 and 24. As we noted that this lecture is all about the recommendation and feasibility report. In part 1, we have discussed the basic introduction about the feasibility and recommendation reports. Along with that, we have discussed in detail how to plan the recommendation report, in which we discussed um, several factors, especially the criteria which involved in planning the recommendation report. In this lecture, we will focus on 3 major topics that we have, especially drafting the recommendation report, because after planning you are going to draft that report, and after drafting we will see planning of the feasibility report, and after planning we will see writing the feasibility report. So we have 3 major topics here that we will discuss. So we will start from how to draft the recommendation report. In drafting the recommendation report, we have several subsections to develop this report. That is, first we will discuss in detail about the introduction. Then we will discuss the purpose, how we write the purpose statement and all that stuff. After that we will discuss method of gathering information. Then we will discuss the background, and then the recommendation more specifically, and the discussion section. So generally these are the major headings that we need to know, that how to write these section while drafting the recommendation report. We will discuss each of the that subsection in detail. First we have the introduction part, because after you have gathered and interpret the data, you have to develop an introduction, basically, that orients the readers to the problems and organization of the report, because the introduction is very much important to make readers confident enough to accept your recommendation, because in recommendation report you can mix the elements of the introduction in many ways, but you have to include some important elements, because without those elements the introduction will be incomplete, or it will be not easy to understand by the reader, because we have understood this idea that audience is very important, your reader is very important. You have to read the mind of the reader, what the reader wants. So there are major 4 elements that you have to think about it. Number 1, we have a statement of purpose. After that, explanation of method or of investigation, and then we have the statement of scope and explanation of problem. Remember, we don't have to write a lengthy introduction, so the reader maybe get bored about it, or maybe the reader lose interest in your report. So the introduction must be to the point and very much associated with the specific topic. That, for example, if you are writing a recommendation report for recommendation of a specific motor or a specific specific equipment, electronic equipment or telecommunication equipment, then you have to figure out your boundary, that in what way you will write the introduction. But keep these four elements like I discussed earlier, keep it in your mind, like a statement of the purpose, explanation of the method of investigation, and a statement of scope and explanation of the problem. This is very important. If you cover these all the elements, then it will be easy for the reader to understand your whole report. Now you can also do that, divide each of the section into the one paragraph, or you can write it into whole one single paragraph, or divide into two. It all depend on your length of your introduction, or specifically the topic, because some of the topic are very detailed and you must have to discuss in very detailed introduction. For example, like if you are going to write a recommendation report on of a large industrial unit, then your statement must be broad, your explanation, your method of explanation will be broad, your statement of scope will be different, and also the explanation of your problem is also very different, because if you are covering too many elements, then you have a lot of material to write in the recommendation. So this is all about the introduction part. The second one we have the purpose. The purpose of the recommendation report is very important to understand for the writer first, because whenever you are going to write a recommendation report, the purpose must be clear in your mind, that why are you writing this report. For example, if you are writing an audit report, then the purpose must be clear, that you have to write all the anomalies that you see in the process, and also in audit you have to present some recommendations, because the major task for the audit is to rectify those mistakes. So the purpose is very important. So being a recommendation report, begin a writer of the recommendation report, you always begin a recommendation report with a straightforward statement. For example, the purpose of this report is this, and this report recommends this. So in that single statement you cover the whole purpose of your recommendation report. Always remember, the purpose should not be vague. It should be very clear. For example, don't write the vague statement. If the purpose is very clear, for example, the purpose of this report is to audit and financial of ABC company. So it will be very clear to all of them that this report only depicts the financial aspects of that specific company. So, and the recommendation generated through that report, that will also belong to that financial aspects only. So the purpose is important. Now in the next slide we will cover the method of gathering information. The next heading we have the method of gathering information. It is very important because it depends on the information, that how you write. For example, if you are getting the wrong information or wrong data, so you will write different recommendation. So always remember the method of gathering information, and the information you gather must be very much crystal clear. So because all that data represents your recommendation. Generally there are four major methods of gathering the data. One is observing, the second one we have testing, and the third one interviewing and rating. So how these, for example, four topics for methods, or four major methods, I must say, depicts your gathering of information. Number one, observing. For example, if your task is to write a recommendation report um, on a specific vicinity or a specific process or any industrial process, then what you do? First, you visit that place. When you visit that place, you observe something. And what you observe the environment, you observe how the machine is working, how the process is working. This is your first observation, which will, I might say, it will be a walkthrough observation also. After that observation, you can order some testing. You can test a specific equipment, you can test or calibrate the sensors or all those stuff. The third one is you can interview. You can interview the labor working on the machine, you can interview the supervisor working on that machine. You can also interview the people who are doing the maintenance job on that machine. So there are different perspective you will get by interviewing different people on the specific process. The fourth is the reading. You can read different materials. You can read through different vendors document, you can read different data sheets, or you can read different books, and on the basis on the reference of that specific books and material, you will write your recommendation. But always remember, keep a record of all the data you have gathered, because in some of the cases you have gathered the data but you don't have the record. So whenever you have to show the record or show the evidence, why are you why you recommend this, so generally people don't have the record. So always, whatever you do, always have a record. Like if you are observing something or you are visiting a specific vicinity, you can take pictures or you can write a specific data, especially in testing period. You have the a report of that testing, and in interviewing you can record the interview most of the time. And in reading, of course, you can give the reference of the textbook, of the research paper, or of the data sheets or the vendor documents that you are reading. So it will comprise a whole set from where you can gather the data. Remember, this is one of the most important part, because the wrong data always depict the wrong recommendation. The right data always depict the right recommendation. Now we have the background. Well, in the background section, you generally discuss the whole background of the problem or the issue that on which you are going to recommend this, for example, on which you are writing your recommendation report. For example, if there is a problem in a specific industrial process and you are writing a recommendation a report to solve those problems, then before you give your recommendation, you first have to mention about the background, that what is the background, what is the process problem. And for example, if you're facing financial loss, in that case you can depict it in your report, and you can write in report, because whenever you write a background, so the reader must get have a clear idea that on the basis of that background, so this recommendation is enough or not. For example, if I'm writing a recommendation report on how to lower our energy bill, so what I will do, first I will write a complete background that, for example, uh, the bill is high and it is very much difficult for our financial structure to pay that bill. So what we can do, we have a recommendation report, or we have a recommendation or suggestion section that how we can lower our energy bill. So in that case, you have to manage or write a complete background in a very precise way. You don't have to write the whole stories about that process. You have to only pinpoint that specific sections that are responsible for this whole mess. And now we have the final recommendation section. Well, the recommendation resolve the problem that occasioned the report. Like for the short reports, like the sample presented um, in our last section, you can write 1 to 4 sentences, which will be sufficient enough. But for the complex report or a longer version of the reports, you may write in the bullet forms also, and even you can write in multiple paragraphs. It always depend on the nature of the report. For example, if your recommendation belongs to some very much large process, so you can write in the form of multiple paragraphs. But in the other reports, your bullet points or specific points should be very much helpful. In that case, always remember, you have to write in very concise recommendation. Your sentences must be very clear. If the sentences are not clear, the reader might be get confused in that way. So your sentences must be clear in order to convey your recommendation clearly to the concerned authorities. Now we have the last section, um, that we have the discussion section. In discussion section, you generally write your recommendation, and I must say you can brief your points of recommendation. You can write up, for example, a shorter version of impact sentences that is very much necessary for the readers. So the discussion section must be linked with the, for example, if you have tested something, or if you have observed something that is very keen, so you can discuss in this section. And these two sections, like recommendation and discussion, are very much interlinked with each other, because the recommendation you gave, you have to somehow discuss in this section. The next one we have the planning the feasibility report. As we know that the feasibility reports investigate whether to undertake a project or not. For example, as in my introduction, I already mentioned between the difference between the feasibility and the recommendation report. Before starting any project, you have to the feasibility studies have been conducted, and in that feasibility studies, the feasibility reports generally generated in order to for example, investigate whether this project is workable or not. All the aspects, specifically the human resource aspect, the financial aspects, and the need aspect, also very important, will be discussed in the feasibility reports. Generally, these type of reports, the planning is very important in these feasibility reports, because if it is feasible, the company will start a specific project, and if it is not feasible, the company will not start a specific project. There are major four factors that we will discuss in our planning the feasibility report section. Number one, we have considered the audience, how the audience is or our reader is important. Number two is determination of the criteria. Number three is determination of the standards, and the last one we have the structure. So in a structure case, we have to discuss different structures that will help us in planning the feasibility report. The first criteria that we will discuss is consider the audience or readers. As we know that generally the audience is familiar with the situation in the broad outline. Your job is to give the specific information that is related to that project. For example, if you are writing a feasibility report about installation of a new, for example, HVAC system, then all the managers that are related to the mechanical section or that are related to the environment section are very much well aware of the need of that specific project. But your report, your feasibility will be more specific to that specific area. Now your report will discuss several factors that may be unknown to them, like the financial health of the industry. For example, if the project cost, for example, 5 million, then the company must think that if they have the enough budget to start that project. And the secondly, if the company, if the project required the highly skilled worker, the company must think that if they have the skilled worker or not. For example, if the company need the project to be completed in 1 year, so how much time is required? So all these area or specific topics should be covered in your feasibility report. Always remember, your feasibility report is the key. And by writing the feasibility report, your research is very important. If the research is weak, your feasibility is weak. And the most importantly, you have to support your feasibility reports by some official documents, like the financial. When you are depicting the financial aspects, the financial manager must be must be very much well aware of that. And the second one, for example, if you are depicting the highly skilled workers, your HR manager, human resource manager, must be well aware of that human resource shortage. Same is the case. There are so many people that are associated with that project. Along with that, all the prior information they have, they are not the new ones or the new guys to look at on a very new project. They all know why this feasibility report has been conducted. So if the project is not feasible, it will not get approved, and if the project is feasible, it will get approved by the competent authority. So it is all depend on the information you give. Generally, feasibility report is the first idea And I must say, the feasibility report is the first complete assessment of the ins and outs of the companies, that they can bear a specific project or not. If they cannot, they simply reject that project very easily, because they cannot fulfill the needs of that project. Now we have the determine the criteria. Criteria is established either by a management committee, or we should follow a prevailing practice. Either a group directs investigator to consider criteria such as cost and the competition level. The way a knowledgeable expert investigate this type of project propose activity. For instance, cost recovery is always considered in the evaluation of a capital investment report or a capital investment project. The financial expert will calculate the payback period, the initial investment, the loan they have to bear, and all that important aspect. So, if you have to discover that. For example, all the details, then it is a very much difficult work, and a very much important task to carry out. So the criteria must be very important. You first list down the criteria, and then you have to start your research. Now we have the determination of the standards. Well, to determine the standard is to state the limits of the criteria that we discussed in our previous section. If the topic is reimbursement for acceptable expenses, you must determine the standards to use to judge whether the stated expenses fall within the acceptable limit or not. Generally, these standards required expert advice unless they exist as policy. So it is very much important to determine the standards that is based on your criteria you selected. So when you determine the standards, you can specifically judge those elements that is important for that feasibility report. The next one we have is structured by the criteria. The discussion section of the feasibility report is structured by the criteria. This reimbursement report could include section on allowable growth, time recovery of investment, and disposal cost. So it is just related to our criteria section, that is determination of the criteria. So when you determine the specific criteria, its structure will also be discussed. The next section we have the writing the feasibility report. Well, after the planning section, we have to draft this feasibility report, and it is not so much difficult, because specifically your research part is the key. If the research is very good and appropriate, so it will not be a problem to draft or write the feasibility report. In this section we will discuss the two major aspects of drafting the feasibility report. First we will discuss what format you have to choose, and the second is how you can write the introduction, and what are the major sections that comprise the whole body of the report. The first one we have choose a format. Well, the format is very important. The format will help you whether you have to choose or you have to use formal or informal style of writing your feasibility studies. because as a rule of thumb, use the formal format for lengthy report intended for a group of clients. Because the informal format is suitable for a brief report intended to determine the feasibility of an internal suggestions. If the format is provided by the company or industry or a specific section to whom you are writing the report, then you don't have to worry. You have to follow that footsteps, and you will write a you will have a complete format. But if the format is not given, then you can follow these specific guidelines that basically depicts comprehensive format. Always remember, like I discussed earlier, when you have to write a longer version of the report for a specific client, then you use a formal type. But if you are using, if you are writing a report for a small section, then you can use the informal reporter style. So follow these steps while choosing a format for a for writing or drafting the feasibility report. The format must be very concise and to the point. It may consist of visual aids, graphs, tables, recommendations also. Writing the introduction and body. Well, in the introduction, present appropriate background, conclusion, and recommendation. You can treat this introduction same as the recommendation introduction, as which we have discussed in our previous recommendation section. But in this in the discussion section, you have to present the detail for each topic that you have mentioned, because as in the recommendation report, you should present the topic, the standard relevant details, and conclusion. But in that case, you have to figure out a specific topic based on your specific project. For example, you have a detail introduction section, you have a detail analysis section, and also and on the basis on in analysis section, you may have different tables, you may have different graphs in which you are going to show the complete description of your topic, and you will have to discuss it, because when you are going to discuss the cost, when you are going to discuss the comparison or comparative analysis, you have to draw the table. So in that case, uh, if you're good at using visual aids like graphs, pie charts, tables, then you can use it. But always remember that always use in a proper manner. Don't use it too much that the reader may get confused, and always write a proper description of your tables and the figures. Uh, this is the conclusion of the whole lecture. In this lecture, we have discussed the complete recommendation and feasibility reports, how you can write the feasibility and recommendation reports, what are the do's and don'ts of writing the specific report. Now, in the next lecture, one thing we will do, we will discuss different types of report and the examples of that report. So it will be very helpful for you to figure out which one is informal report, which one is recommendation report, which one is feasibility report, and which one is a formal report. We will discuss some of the examples, and especially how to evaluate those reports, because the evaluation is very important. You must know that on which basis your report has been evaluated, and we will discuss in detail because we have discussed in our previous 4 weeks lecture about only about report writing. Like first we have discussed about technical reports, then we have discussed informal, formal reports, and now the feasibility report. So we will discuss in detail, so it will be very easy for you to compare between these reports. Thank you.